All right, hey everybody. Welcome to Chapter 5. We're going to talk today about externalities. Hopefully everybody has read through the chapter already and has a fairly good understanding of what the material is about. Externalities is a nice chapter in the sense that there's nothing too overwhelming in the sense of any math or in the sense of any major graphing. It's really just some concepts that we can introduce into our discussion of the supply and demand model and help make things a little more, let's use the word realistic. We've been exploring so far in our course about the supply and demand model, and we've got our general supply and demand model. There we go, label our curves and so on. And we've said that this supply and demand model is efficient and it's equitable. We've examined how we use our supply and demand model to allocate resources and how the allocation of these resources leads to economic surplus, which is a form of well-being for consumers and consumers and suppliers in the market, and so on. So we've really spent the first part of the course kind of building up the supply and demand model and showing how useful it is and how effective it is when it comes to resource allocation in our economy. Now, what we do in externalities is look at the possibility that our supply and demand model may actually not be as effective or as efficient as we want it to be at all times in our economy. And what I mean when I say that is if I take this supply and demand model that we've put on the board here, and I say that yes, we've reached an equilibrium quantity, we've reached an equilibrium price, and we are not having any shortages or surpluses, that therefore we're being efficient. And when we talk about externalities, we're saying, well, what if that's not actually the case? What if our market appears to be efficient and to be allocating the correct number of resources, but if we take everything into consideration, that's actually not true? So we're going to explore that particular form of market failure. And as we're doing that, we are also going to be exploring a couple of other concepts. One of them is called the Coase theorem. So we'll look at positive and negative externalities. We'll also talk about what we call the Coase theorem, which is a different method of resolving our problems if we have them in this model. And then to finish off the chapter, there's a section on different types of goods, and we're going to explore how supply and demand isn't always necessarily the model that we need to be using when it comes to resource allocation as well. So that's what we'll be looking at today. So by the end of this, the end of the chapter, the end of our discussion, we'll have talked about positive and negative externalities. We'll have considered how these work on the supply and demand model to create overproduction and underproduction, and how we can work with do things to resolve that. Again, discuss this Coase theorem, and then finally, it's not listed on the outcomes here, but there's a discussion on the different types of goods as well. So I'll be bouncing a little bit back and forth between the slides and the my little Word document there. I'll do my best to keep my writing as neat as possible. So this concept of externalities, if we were to define what we were talking about, what we're saying is that it's just like it sounds. The word external is built into the concept of externalities. And we're saying that in our market, there's some kind of an impact on a innocent bystander, a third party who's not in the market at all, and yet they're being affected in either a good way or a negative way. So here is let's call this my market for widgets. And my market for widgets is in equilibrium, and we're allocating the right number of widgets and so on and so forth. And what's happening is that in the production of these widgets or in the use of these widgets, a third party is being benefited or having costs incurred, and those costs and benefits are not being included in this supply and demand model. And when this happens, what we say is that there's this spillover. There's some kind of an economic cost or benefit being incurred by a third party, which is spilling over from that market. So we'll give a couple examples in a moment, but for now, we can just again say that externalities can be negative or positive. There can be a positive spillover or a negative spillover to a third party. And let's use some examples. So let's talk about the possibility of some negative externalities. So let's say that this market here is the market for cigarette consumption. And we have a market for cigarettes, and cigarettes has an equilibrium price, and there's an equilibrium quantity of cigarettes being produced, and all is well. So we're technically we're producing the correct number of cigarettes. We'll use that word. The problem is that in the when we've captured the price of the package of cigarettes and we've determined the correct quantity to allocate, we haven't taken into account that there's a lot of negative external effects when it comes to smoking. So if we sell all of these cigarettes and people consume them and they pay, let's just say, $5 per package of cigarettes, one thing we haven't worked into this is that there is a cost to smoking that's not captured in the price of the cigarettes themselves. And namely, that in this case would be healthcare. So we know that 1 out of every 2 smokers passes away from lung cancer and emphysema and those types of things. And when these people do get sick, there is a cost to look after them to society. We have to pay there's cancer treatments and different things. And those costs are borne by, in Canada at least, we have our universal healthcare system. So everybody has to kind of contribute to helping to pay for those healthcare costs. So there's this cost that's being realized by a third party, which in this case would be society. And yet, when the person is buying the package of cigarettes, those costs are not included in the package. So there's this additional economic cost that our supply and demand model is not capturing when the cigarettes are produced. We can look at other forms of negative externalities as well with alcohol sales, for example. Alcohol in and of itself is fine, but when some people use it creates a lot of negative outcomes. There's problems with drinking and driving, there's problems with domestic violence, there's problems with all kinds of things that are requiring additional resources. There's cost to society for these things. So that can come in the form of needing extra police, needing extra court system resources, things like that. And those costs are not being captured in the cost of buying a bottle of alcohol, for example. So these are all things that are spilling over from the marketplace. And we could basically say that if this is happening, then even though it appears, and I'm going to draw another model here, so we would say that even though it appears, and I won't put in all the markings, but we know that we're a market in equilibrium here. So here's our market, here's our equilibrium quantity, and we're producing the quantity that society believes is efficient. But we would actually suggest that we are probably overproducing this good or service if we were to count all of the external costs as well. So the truly efficient output might be a lot less than what the market equilibrium output is, right? So I've drawn this second Q here, and we'll say that this might be the actual output that society would prefer, we'll use that word, if we took into account all of those additional considerations. So in this case, we would say we're overproducing these goods. Externalities, though, they don't have to be negative. They can be positive as well. There's things that sometimes we do can have a positive effect on the world around us. And those things aren't being captured in our model either. So if I, for example, was to buy a smoke detector, and let's say I lived in an apartment building, and I go and I buy a smoke detector. There's a market for that. The smoke detectors have an equilibrium price and quantity. And let's say I spend $30 on the smoke detector and I bring it home, put it in my apartment. Okay, so excellent. And one night I have a fire, and because of my super duper smoke detector, I notice that fire ahead of time. I'm able to put it out, and therefore I'm protected. So the smoke detector's done its job. Well, this is good, but also there's been a positive externality because not only am I protected, this has spilled over onto all of my neighbors as well because they've been protected from the potential of having a fire. And yet my neighbors did not have to contribute to the cost of my smoke detector. So they're realizing this benefit without having to incur any of the associated costs. If I was to do some home renovations and I did a really nice job on my front yard and I put in some new landscaping and I put up new siding and I did all these great things to the outside of my house, that's going to have a very positive effect and I'll get my money's worth. But also, my neighbors around me are going to be positively affected as well. They are going to see an increase in their property values. It's going to be a nicer place to live, and there's this positive spillover that my neighbors get to realize, and yet they have not had to contribute to the cost of those home renovations. So again, we're in a situation there where a market transaction has happened, and whether it's negative or positive, there's this spillover effect happening, and other people are being affected without having to either contribute to the positive externality or without being compensated for the costs of the negative externality. So when we examine this, we can use what we know so far, talking about our supply and demand model, and talking specifically as well about the market surplus. So here we're using our terms of consumer and producer surplus to be thinking of well-being in the market. So this is another way of considering it. In my market, I have well-being for the consumers and I have well-being for the producers. And yet, if there's an externality, there's either there's well-being that is not being realized, or there's too much surplus in the sense that we're actually overproducing, and this surplus is coming at the cost of society. So it's very simple how we would actually look at this on the supply and demand model. We can basically assume that the supply and demand model, as we've looked at it so far, is the private market costs and benefits. And we're going to add in a second curve on both supply or demand side to talk about the effect for the overall supply and demand, or the inclusion of those costs or benefits to society as well. Okay, let me explain that. I didn't say it very well. So here is a market for, we'll just call it, we're back to widgets. This is our widgets market. And here we have our equilibrium and our demand curve for widgets. And here is our supply curve for widgets. Right? So I'm going to draw a parallel one up here. So I have my demand curve and I have my supply curve. I have my equilibrium and so on. So that's represented on this graph right. Here's my equilibrium. And instead of calling it just the supply curve, I'm going to call it the S private curve. What I'm saying is that in the private market, this is this would be the supply. And we've also defined supply as being the cost to society. We say that these are the increasing marginal cost of producing more and more of a good. So fair enough. It costs more. It costs more to create greater quantities of widgets. Therefore, we see our upward sloping supply curve. We would see our equilibrium. Now, if I was to take into account the external costs as well, I would have to say that there needs to be an increase in these total costs, right? So to produce, one widget or two widgets or three widgets, here is the private cost of just making the widgets, but then I add in the cost of the healthcare or the cost of the extra policing resources. And I say, well, if I was to include those in the cost of this widget, actually, the supply curve would be shifted. It would be higher or shifted to the left, depending on how you look at it. And really what I would see would be a second supply curve, and I'm going to call this the S social. And this is the supply curve that includes all of those external costs to society. So another way of, if I have a supply curve, here's just a simple way of looking at it. If this is my supply curve for cigarettes, and let's say that the firms had to include the price of healthcare in the cost of the cigarettes, well, that would increase their input costs, and obviously supply would shift to the left, right? And that's exactly what we're seeing here is that supply is shifting to the left because we're going to add on the cost of those externalities. So I'm going to put an S social and an S private. And now I see two different supply curves. I see one that includes these external costs and one that does not include the external costs. So here, my equilibrium, this would be a private equilibrium that is only taking into account the market costs of production and consumption. And after shifting the supply curve, I would actually see a different equilibrium, which does include those external social costs. And I would conclude that the equilibrium price, including social costs, would be a higher equilibrium price at a lower equilibrium quantity. Oops. And again, to use a real world example, let's just assume that's cigarettes, right? So if I was to include the cost of healthcare in the cost of the package of the cigarettes, well, probably going to be true that cigarettes are going to cost more money and we are going to be producing less of them to be truly efficient in our marketplace. And if I was to map this on the positive externalities, sorry, one second. There, just move that a bit. If I was to map this with positive externalities, I'd be saying kind of the same thing. I've got my demand curve, which is sloping downwards, and I'm saying that so here's the private market demand, but it's not necessarily including all of the social benefits. And if it was true that we included the social benefits, then we would probably want to see a greater demand in the marketplace, and we would have a social demand curve. Right? So we'd have a demand private. This would be demand just for the good. But then let's add in all of the benefits that society is getting and say, well, if those were included, then the demand would actually shift to the right and we would see a D social. So for goods and services that we get an external benefit from, in this case, they're using vaccinations. So here at this intersection between the supply curve and the private demand curve, this is the cost and benefit of producing the good in and of itself without taking into account extra value to the world around us. Well, if we include that extra value, we'll shift that demand curve to the right and we'll have our social demand curve. And that would have a new equilibrium. And we could say that if we included all the value that everybody's getting from this smoke detector, we'd see a greater demand. And because of that, we would probably see more smoke detectors being produced. And because of that, they would probably be produced at a higher price. The equilibrium price would be higher. We just value this good more because of all the extra benefit that it's providing. And it's really that simple. We're just saying that if we took into account external costs and benefits, we would increase or decrease supplier demand to account for that. So the nice thing is that we've already explored how we could possibly do this, and probably the most common method of resolving externalities is through the use of taxes. Our government will tax goods that have negative externalities. If my examples of alcohol and tobacco, both of those products are heavily taxed. Well, let's do tax first, then we'll go to the other side. So let's say that this is our market for cigarettes. We have our private supply, and then the government says, well, I'm going to come in and I'm going to add a tax to that good. And just like we looked at in Chapter 4, well, that means that costs would increase, right, if we add the tax onto the supply side. And we could do our second supply curve there, which is now shifted. So if the government does implement a tax, this has the effect of shifting supply to the left. And we now have an equilibrium, which includes our cigarettes have now gone up in price, and we've seen a decrease in the total quantity. And what's happened there is the government has just stepped in and said, okay, we're going to tax this good. Those taxes will be used for the health care. This is how we're going to offset all those extra healthcare costs. And we are stepping into this market in order to resolve that issue. So this is our true equilibrium, including the healthcare costs. This would be our market equilibrium without the healthcare costs. And you can see too that in the market equilibrium, maybe we'll draw this here. So our market equilibrium has this area of total surplus, but if I was to get rid of that, if I was to move my supply curve, this would be the new area of total surplus. And we could see that, so here is our new quantity produced. Here is our old quantity produced. It used to be true that we were actually overproducing. There was this dead weight loss, which would be represented in this area here. We have this extra dead weight loss from overproduction. So here is our new equilibrium with our new consumer surplus and our sorry, I said supplier surplus, producer surplus. And this extra quantity is what we were actually overproducing, even though it seemed like we were in equilibrium. So area, in this case, K, is representing a dead weight loss if we're only relying on the marketplace. I hope that makes sense. I'm more than happy to explain it further at the drop-in session. But all we're really saying is that as it was, the market was overproducing, and therefore we were incurring a dead weight loss. If we shift that supply curve by adding a tax, we resolve the externality, and of course this is going to have an effect on our surplus as well. If I was to do the same thing, looking at a positive externality, I would be shifting the demand curve to the right. So this would be a subsidy. A subsidy, of course, is where we add extra money into the marketplace. So if I have a market for electric vehicles, and this is something that was subsidized for a while, we have our equilibrium, we have the right number of lithium batteries being sold, and then the government says, you know what, we're going to offset that externality. Society is realizing all of these benefits, so we're going to take those benefits and we're going to actually just put money directly into the market. So for every unit you purchase, we will help pay for the cost, and that will shift our demand curve to the right. And therefore, we have a new socially optimum equilibrium. And therefore, we can show that at this higher quantity, it used to be true that we were underproducing. So therefore, there's a dead weight loss. And I know there's lots of like lines here on this graph, but this is really all we're saying is that if I take this equilibrium, if I shift the demand and therefore increase the quantity, it goes to show that if this is the more efficient quantity, then we were underproducing, and therefore the actual total surplus should have been larger, and there's a dead weight loss that was being incurred. So that's the overall concept of externalities. It's simply that our supply and demand model is kind of inaccurate because it's not taking everything into account when we think about these external costs and benefits. In order to take those things into account, we would need to shift one of these curves, either supply or we would need to shift demand. Right? Make a second demand curve there, and that would account for the additional costs and benefits. And we can do this with taxes and subsidies. We can actually make that curve shift to the more socially optimum level, which changes equilibrium. And therefore, we can also count what the dead weight loss would have been for overproduction and underproduction if we were not counting for those external costs and benefits. So that's really externalities there. And then we just consider that there's other methods as well of resolving externalities. And the one that the textbook talks about is Coe's theorem. So if an externality is an unrealized cost or benefit, we can use government intervention with taxes and subsidies to resolve them. We can also use other methods. We can use something called command and control, which just means the government just puts in a regulation, right? So if your company is polluting, you're making all of this, you're making your widgets and it's creating all of this pollution in the atmosphere. The government may just say, well, you can't do that. So you have to adhere to this rule or that rule. And that's just called command and control. It just means regulation, right? So you're not allowed to put out more than X number of gases per year. There's other methods called cap and trade that we don't need to get into, but here there's a discussion of private solutions. So this is called the Coase theorem, and Coase is named for Ronald Coase. He was a famous in economic circles. He actually won a Nobel Prize for this Coase theorem, which basically just says that people can work out with one another to resolve these externalities in certain situations. So if you have two parties and the actions of one party is affecting another party, then they can just bargain with one another if there's certain features that exist, right? So the Coase theorem says if a couple of things are true, if it's very clear who owns what, so the property rights are very well defined, and it doesn't really cost us in terms of negotiating, which we would just call like transaction costs, then we can just come to a deal between ourselves. So if something you're doing is negatively affecting me, then as long as it's relatively painless for us to just get together and talk about it, then we can agree on some form of compensation in order to resolve it without counting on the government to intervene. So what could that look like? Well, I can think of a pretty good example of a positive externality in my business in property management. There was a situation where we had a neighbor's building had a lot of these kind of scraggly trees that were growing on their property, and there would have been a cost to cut those trees down. The problem for our property was that the trees were interfering with security because it was preventing visibility on. So let's just say I've got two buildings here, building one and building two, right? And this building has these kind of trees growing up, da 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 da. It's on their property, and because of these trees, security in my parking lot was poor, right? So normally people would be able to view what was going on in this parking lot, but because of the trees, they couldn't, right? So the neighbor owns the trees, right? It's up to them to look after them. There's a cost to pulling them down, but there's a problem that it's creating on this property because it's interfering with security. So there's this cost. There's a benefit to removing these trees, but the neighbor owns them all. So here we need to come to some kind of a resolution, and the Coase theorem just says, well, let's work it out. What if this building B came to neighbor A and said, hey, I see you have these trees. I'll tell you what, if you take them out or get somebody to look after them, I'll help pay for the cost of that, right? And in that way, even though it's not our property, it's not our responsibility, if we contribute to the cost of it, then we get to realize this extra benefit, right? So we can come to this kind of agreement, and there's lots of examples of how this could work. We can come to this agreement where I will compensate you for the cost, or I will perhaps pass on some of the benefits, whatever it might be, as long as we can do that reasonably. And this is going to be something that we can just work out without it. We don't have to get our lawyers involved and meet for 30 hours and incur all of these costs just in trying to negotiate it. So that's basically what the Coase theorem is just saying that, hey, we can, without having the government step in to regulate this, I'm sure I could petition City Hall and have them make a regulation that trees can be no taller than 6 feet and, all of these things. Well, why don't we just bypass all of that and resolve this economic imbalance between us privately? So that's really the concept of Chapter 5. Is just how do we deal with these third-party costs and benefits that aren't being included in the market. And then there's this final concept in Chapter 5, which is about the categorization of goods and services. So the reason we've introduced this here, you'll see in a moment, is that What we've done in Chapter 5 is kind of break apart the supply and demand model a bit and say that there are certain situations where it's not quite as effective as we originally put it out to be, although it can be as long as we make those adjustments. So our markets are not necessarily efficient just on their own at distributing goods and services. And the other thing we need to consider that we bring into discussion in Chapter 5 is that sometimes the market completely and absolutely fails to distribute resources effectively. Markets are actually only good with very specific types of goods, and we'll kind of look at what that means. So here's our market. It's let's just assume there's no externalities, and it's doing its great job of saying this is the number of resources we need for this product. Well, we're going to break products out into different categories, or resources out into different categories. And this isn't really intuitive, but it'll make perfect sense once you see it. If I take any resource or any product, I can basically say that if I answer two questions about it, I can kind of categorize it. And the questions are whether the good or service is rival, which means do we compete for it, and is it excludable, which means can we prevent people from accessing it, or can we make people pay for it? And depending on how we answer these questions, we will get different categories of goods, and we'll see how it's not actually possible to allocate all goods using our private market. So if I have, I'm just going to do this on the page here. So if I have a good that is rival, that means that we are either competing for it or we are not competing for it. So there's certain goods and services that we compete for. The laptop, the water bottle, the hoodie. You can own it or I can own it, but both of us can't own it at the same time. There's only one copy of that good. But there's other goods and services that, I'm going to draw a grid here. So there's other goods and services where that wouldn't be true. And an example might be something like Netflix would be something that's not rival. You can have Netflix and I can have Netflix, and we're not, the fact that you have it doesn't mean I'm not having it, and so on. So we can break out goods into whether only one of us can have it or not, and we can say yes or no. And then we can also break out products into, or resources, let's just say, into whether they are excludable. Can I prevent you from accessing the good, right? Based on whether you are paying for it or not. And for all of those original things like hoodies and laptops and water bottles, it's true that we can exclude you from accessing them as well. So for hoodies and laptops and water bottles, we are competing for that good. And at the same time, we can prevent other people from purchasing the good. If they don't pay, you can't have it. So this is a quadrant of, if we answer yes to both of these questions, then we're up here in this quadrant. If we, and here I'm going to kind of move down to this other grid. So this one, rival is on the rival, yes. Excludable, yes. These are the things that we can exclude people from using, and we're competing for them. These are private goods. This is our hoodies, our water bottles, and our laptops, right? So anything that we buy in the free market is generally what we would consider a private good. Supply and demand model works perfectly well at allocating them, and we absolutely rely upon it to allocate those resources. Now, if we are competing for the good, but we cannot prevent people from accessing the resource, then that is a non-excludable good. And this would be, we would call these common goods or common resources. And typically what we're talking about here is just the nature around us, right? The water in the ocean, I can't stop you from, yes, we are competing for that glass of water, but you're just as free to go up and get a glass as I am, right? Or the air that we're breathing, and so on and so on. So there's things that we just use in common, and even though we are competing for them, we can't prevent people from accessing them. Now, back over here to excludable. If I can prevent you from accessing a good, For example, Netflix or just the internet in general, things like that. But we're not competing for their usage. So yeah, we can both be on cable internet, and the fact that you're using it doesn't mean that I have any less internet. Um, this is what we something we call a quasi-public good. Also, we would call this a natural monopoly. We'll kind of talk about these things later too, but we can still use supply and demand to allocate these goods as well. It just looks a little bit differently, which we'll get into in like chapter 10. But let's say goods and services we are not competing for and we can't prevent people from using. Here we're into a type of good that we would call a public good. So, can we think of examples of goods that we can't prevent anyone from benefiting from, and we also aren't competing to use them? A great example is the protection from the military. So, we have these resources being devoted to protection. If our military, so let's say the United States decides to invade us, we'll fight back as best we can. Our military is going to protect us, and everybody's going to be protected, right? So it's not excludable. It's not like we're protecting some Canadians but not others. And in fact, we're not competing for that. It's not like you can be protected and I can't. There's that protection covers us all, right? Or if there's a light in a public area, right? So here's my light post and it's beaming light down. Well, anybody can walk underneath the light, right? And we can't prevent anybody from accessing it. And the fact that the light is shining on you doesn't mean that it's not going to shine on me. And therefore, we can't, we're not competing for it. We can't exclude people from using it. This is basically what we call a public good, and public just means by public we just mean kind of available for anybody. So we have a bit of a problem here. I'm going to draw a bit of a line going through these goods. When it comes to non-excludable goods, we are in a situation where we cannot use supply and demand to allocate these resources. The very fact of the basic point of the supply and demand model is that some people can be priced out of supplying and some people can be priced out of purchasing, right? And if we can't price these people out, if people can access the good no matter what, then our supply and demand model is simply not going to be effective in producing. So, can you imagine the military if we we protect ourselves from an invasion, and then we go around with a credit card machine for every Canadian, and it's somehow only those people who are willing to spend $50 get the whole thing just doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. Um, so we have basically two sets of problems. We have with common goods and public goods and common resources. When it comes to common goods, there's something called the tragedy of the commons, which means that because we're competing for them, but everybody has access, then what happens is we will destroy the good. And just think of all the fishing off of the coast of the ocean. So nobody can be prevented from fishing. Uh, excuse me. And it's in all of our best interest to get as much fish for ourselves as possible. And therefore, we're just going to completely fish it dry, right? We're going to destroy this resource by everybody consuming as much as they can for themselves. So there's this tragedy of the commons problem. And when it comes to public goods, there's something we call the free rider problem, which is that if I'm going to receive the benefits of this good and you can't prevent me from using them, then why should I pay? Why don't I let all my neighbors pay and I'll get all the benefits without having to incur any of the costs? So that's called a free rider problem. And in both cases here, we once again need government intervention, right? So our government is going to step in and do regulation on these common resources. Like, no, you can't pull out all of these fish from the sea. You can only pull out so many. And the government will step in to resolve the free rider problem by providing that public good at the community level, at the government level, and making sure that everybody is paying for it by taxing people in order to be able to provide it. So you can see our government actually plays a pretty critical role. So you get your private goods here, you've got your natural. Actually, I'm not going to use that one because I used different quadrants. But anyway, our government is over here, protecting our common resources, supplying our public goods, and even here in the private markets, they are regulating and implementing the court systems to ensure fairness and so on. So even though our economy is not a command economy, the government still has a very strong role in this in our economy. Again, kind of regulating, refereeing, and at times even providing goods and services and taxing for them to make sure that everybody is paying equally. Um, so if we don't have that occur, if the government is not regulating correctly, then the tragedy of the commons says people will overconsume and just destroy the resource. And then with public goods, that free rider problem becomes an issue. The natural monopolies or the quasi-public goods, we'll get into this as its own chapter. We'll talk about monopoly very specifically when we begin talking about market types. So these are the key terms for this chapter. So we've defined the externality. We've looked at how those externalities would actually create a separate demand or supply curve that we could call the social optimum. We can tax negative externalities with some. We didn't use the word, but it's called a Pigouvian tax. Arthur Pigou came up with that concept. Those externalities are positive or negatives, can be positive or negative. The private market does not include the externality. And then we looked at, I wish these were in a bit better order. Then we looked at how the Coase theorem can be used to privately resolve them. And then last of all, we just defined the different types of goods with non-excludable goods. So that's it. Again, chapter 5 is not very demanding on us. It's just those basic concepts, and I will look forward to seeing you guys at the drop-in session if you'd like any additional help, and or email me directly. All right, thanks everybody.